Why did the British Army perform so poorly at the tactical, operational and strategic level at the start of the Second World War? We look at the lessons learnt from the First World War and the lessons forgotten during the interwar period.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 107 of the Principles of War podcast, Force Design and Doctrine Development with the British Army during the interwar period. This is the second part of our interview with Dr Robert Lyman. He co-authored the book Victory to Defeat, the British Army 1918 to 1940, which he co-wrote with Lord Dannatt, a previous Chief of the General Staff of the British Army. If you haven't listened to the first episode, definitely have a listen. We look at how the British Army learnt to learn in the First World War. Today we're going to be looking at the lessons that were learnt, particularly how they were able to generate combined arms in 1918 and achieve the victories of the 100 Days. Those lessons were very important. They enabled the Allies to end the First World War. Those lessons were very expensive, both in blood and treasure. We're going to look at how they were forgotten, why they were forgotten, and then what was the process that the British Army needed to go through to relearn those lessons. Let's get right back into the interview now. As an Australian, it was great to see mention of the Battle of Hamel, and in our 4th Brigade, we still celebrate with a Hamel dinner every year. What were the lessons that were learnt at Hamel?
Well, Hamel was, I think, one of the most critical battles of the war because Monash had been given his head. He was allowed just to do what he wanted to be able to create a solution to defeating the German defensive positions at Hamel. I think there are a number of things. One is a command determination from Monash down and supported by Rawlinson above him to do something slightly different, to sequence artillery in a new way, but also to train the infantry to infiltrate rather than to attack en masse. And I mean, you go back to this idea of infantry soldiers deploying a bit of cunning and a bit of maneuver always achieves quite dramatic effect over doing something stupid. And I think Hamel, for the first time, saw a good plan, thought through very carefully by Monash and his staff, executed very well rehearsed, well trained. We saw in Hamel the first signs of a fully integrated combat maneuver. And it was successful. Because what Monash and the Australians did is they thought very carefully about what they thought the German defenders would do to each phase of the plan. So it included surprise, it included sustainment, included a very carefully thought out artillery plan, with the whole of the 4th Army artillery supporting it, and so on. It's one of those nascent stories, the story of nascent success. By that, I mean early success. And I think Hamel was the basis of much of the planning for the 100 Days a year later. So yes, a critically important battle. And it just demonstrated, actually, to everyone who was observing that sophisticated defenses could be overcome by equally sophisticated offensive operations.
One of the things that I'd never thought about and I found really interesting was that you talked about the armistice ceremonies in 1919 and 1920 were centred around the celebrations of the victories that were achieved in the 100 Days. But that slowly transformed into commemoration of the tragedies of the earlier years. And with this, the lessons of those great victories were lost. Why was it forgotten so quickly?
That's quite extraordinary. We weren't really aware of that until we started looking at memoirs of soldiers who were writing about this in the 1920s. And it's a very, very significant feature of the memory of war. But as I said, a new one to us. It was largely a transformation for a number of reasons. Well, the first reason is because the original commemorations were commemorations by soldiers of victory, commemorations of quite an extraordinary achievement. The 11th of the 11th, 1918, was a tremendous victory for those who took part, and they recognized it as such. But of course, what soldiers don't realize is actually the war was being fought by their families and civil society back home. And civil society had a very different view of the war. Civil society only saw the blood and the treasure being lost. And it's wrong to use the word hijack, but the entire commemoration of victory in 1918 very, very quickly, and perhaps understandably, became an opportunity for families and society as a whole, yes, to remember the sacrifice, but to mourn the loss of those who had died. Nearly 1 million men and women across the Commonwealth, over 700,000 in the British Isles alone, was quite a devastating loss to this country. And of course, every country in the Empire and Commonwealth suffered loss. I've never met a family who did not have someone who was lost in the First World War, or at least served or lost in the First World War. So there's this dramatic impact on memory of the social consciousness of the time. And the social consciousness of the time was defined by war weariness, by horror at the scale of the casualties, by horror at the physical loss, a very, very large number of widows and young women who would never marry as a consequence of the First World War, taking out, it's unfair to say it's a generation of young men, but a very large proportion of it. I forget the percentage, I think it's 8 or 9%. So, a very, very significant dent in the number of men who are eligible for marriage just disappeared. And in fact, everyone lost somebody. So that sense of loss dominated. And it's very interesting the old contemptibles who were the remnants of the 1914 BEF kept on meeting until they all passed away. They wrapped up, I think, in the 1970s. But as you can find some of their meetings, there are celebrations on YouTube, and they kept alive this idea that they were celebrating victory. They were celebrating service and celebrating victory. They got together for boozy piss-ups on a regular basis. And as a consequence, you had this separation. And you have it today, actually. You have soldiers, I'm involved in a few as well, where you get together to remember comrades and you remember operations you went on together, and you celebrate comradeship. You remember those of your friends who are lost, and we lost a lot of people, but in modern operations. But actually, you rejoice nevertheless. There's a very, very different feature of remembrance when you weren't involved. And I think all we do is we need to recognize that there are two types of remembrance of those who were there and the remembrance of those who weren't there, that they're not mutually exclusive. And, what one is not less or more important than the other, but they are different.
One of the things that I think we see through history is that victory is often a poor teacher compared to defeat, and especially profound defeat. To what degree do you think that played a role in the development of the Wehrmacht's doctrine and tactics against the British somnambulance in the interwar period?
Completely. That really just defines it. So, and we know from all the German memoirs, we had a little look at some of them. The Reichswehr, which was formed after Versailles, was limited to 100,000 men, but actually under a number of very, very smart thinkers, the Reichswehr concentrated on creating a kernel, a group, a core of young leaders who could think about fighting in a new way. And we know that they expressly examined the reasons for success of the 100 Days battles. They examined very closely the reasons for the collapse of Ludendorff's armies. We need to remember that by the end of 1918, the German defensive plan was largely the same that had been in 1916. And people forget that. The German defense in France was not a defense in depth. The Hindenburg Line wasn't defense in depth. It was a linear defense, and it was easily overcome, actually. But the Germans looked at that and they thought, well, if we are going to fight this sort of war again, or a similar war, we need to understand how to succeed. And they, through the 1920s, but particularly in the early 1930s, did quite an extraordinary amount of doctrinal innovation. And they did it on paper. They also did it on what we would call tutes, tactical exercises, where our troops, where they use whistles and rattles and flags to denote the movements of brigades, companies, battalions, brigades, and divisions. And they did a lot of it. They were operating at what we describe as the operational level of war, i.e. at corps and army level in tutes. And they were replete. They did a huge amount. This is an old Prussian we always regard it as a Prussian eccentricity, but that's in the British Army, who were frankly much less professional in this regard than the Germans. They spent a lot of their time walking across prospective battlefields, planning where they would operate and how they would operate. When they had the opportunity in Russia, they developed training facilities in the Soviet Union, a secret, of course, because these were forbidden by Versailles, where they were able to train and plan some very, very sophisticated operations. So the idea of parachuting troops ahead of armored and infantry formations were developed in Russia in the 1920s, believe it or not. Quite extraordinary. So what we saw in 1940 as an expression of blitzkrieg was the product of German defeat in 1918 and 20 years of very, very sophisticated thinking. Now, I'll hear some of you say, well, Rob, until Plan Yellow was executed in 1940, the German plan against the Allies in France and Belgium was much less sophisticated. And I grant you that, that's true. But actually what the Wehrmacht had from top to bottom was a very comprehensive concept of mission command, which basically enabled soldiers at section and platoon level to understand what their operational objective was and to do everything they could, like Duff Cooper and his platoon in 1918, to achieve the commander's intent. Now, that's a fundamentally different way of operating as a soldier to how the Germans operated in the First World War, a very, very significant difference, and it was a very significantly different to how the British Army was operating in 1940 and would have achieved effectively those armoured and infantry and air coordinated Stuka air artillery vanguards, which I call Operation Maneuver Groups for obvious reasons, in 1940. So yes, the attack through the Ardennes was a late plan, Manstein's plan, and it was achieved superlative results very, very quickly. 6 weeks the German army was at the sea, but even without Plan Yellow, without this extraordinary move through the Ardennes, the Germans would undoubtedly have destroyed the French and the Belgians and the British in 1940. In any case, it might have taken a little bit longer, but the whole concept of operational maneuver groups, of integrated armored infantry and air-based vanguards breaking through the line, racing to the rear, existed. It might have taken 10 or 12 weeks, not 6, but all those changes that the Germans had developed through the 1920s and the 1930s, we could see in abundance. So, yes, a long answer to your question. Defeat is the author of invention, no doubt about it.
So during the interwar period, I think there's a series of factors that make it difficult for the maintenance of a professional army. We've got the economy, the inability or the unwillingness to maintain an army to fight a continental war, the loss of tactical lessons and the failure to adapt to technology, and also a desire to avoid another world war. Finally, the ability to articulate a clear grand strategic endstate. So looking at the economy first, to what degree do you think that there was a desire to avoid the costs required to maintain the Defence Force? How did that impact the army, particularly when the Air Force and Navy were fighting for their share of a ever-decreasing fiscal pie? And how do you maintain that during the Depression?
The reality is it wasn't achieved through the Depression, and the economy was a fundamental problem. But it's worth just saying that the problems with the economy occurred much later in the 1920s and occurred at a time when actually the army in particular had lost the battle for dominance and strategic thinking. And whilst the economy through the Depression and the early 1930s had a dramatic effect on the army, we came to the conclusion that it was a result of poor thinking, a lack of strategic thinking, rather than the cause of it. So in the book, we're pretty even-handed in our blame. We blame the army, but we blame government as well. It wasn't simply a matter of underfunding. And the reason why we say that is because, touching on your latter point, our view is that if the army had started off with a strategic perspective about what it might be required to do in the future, and then structured itself accordingly, and acquired the equipment and technology to enable those structures to be effective on the battlefield, at least you would have had a core of knowledge and capability that, no matter how large or small it was, existed as an entity. And we had none of that. The army lost its way very quickly after the end of the First World War. It failed to understand how that it might be needed to fight a high-intense war again. And that was exacerbated by the lack of money in the late 1920s. There is a little bit of a chicken and egg here. There's a relationship between the two. If you as an army believe that you're going to have to fight against the Soviet Union or the Russians, for instance, you look very, very carefully at how they're constructed, how their armed forces are constructed, how they might operate against you, and you build up a strategy to oppose and so on. Exactly what NATO did after the Second World War. And once you've done that, if you've done that, then you've got the intellectual basis of your fighting power. That's about thinking about how you're going to need to fight. If you don't have that, then you've just got arguments about technology, you've got arguments about doctrine that's not bedded or anchored in actuality. The actuality is you need a threat. The problem immediately after the First World War was that people regarded, in the army definitely, regarded the First World War as an anachronism. This was something that was never going to happen again. It was an unusual thing. I mean, this was, if anything like that happened again, then we were lost as a civilization. And so people just turned their back on it and really did revert to 1914. I mean, that's widely evidenced in the documents which we saw. And of course, in Britain, the role of the army had always been to defend the empire. The army was effectively a garrison organization that primarily garrisoned India, 55,000 troops in India, and supported the civil authorities in the management of those colonial societies. But actually, they weren't designed to do anything more than react to something like a Second Boer War. And the extraordinary thing for us is that we went to 1919 and 1920, and no one sat down and said, is the period ahead of us in the next 20, 30 years going to be any different? No one did it. There's not a single piece of evidence in the archives that suggested that anyone, and the chiefs of the general staff, Imperial General Staff as it was at the time, and the War Office, even thought like that. There was a reversion to empire defense. As an aside, we did empire defense very badly because, of course, Britain wasn't prepared to fight a first-class enemy in Malaya and Singapore and Burma in 1942. Now, that was a dramatic failure of imagination and failure of the 1920s and 30s. So if you don't have the kernel of how you are to operate, the intellectual anchor, then you can't influence government to ask you for money. And this is a really important part of our argument. One of the problems that we face in Britain is that the army is never regarded as a strategic tool of defense policy. Now, that might feel strange to you, but it's true. What is regarded as a strategic tool of defense policy? The nuclear deterrent, the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had always been regarded as the instrument that would defend Britain and was, as a result, was our national deterrent. The challenge to the national deterrent in the 1920s came with the nascent Royal Air Force, who latched onto this idea of the bomber will always get through, and that the fundamental feature of modern warfare will be aerial bombing of enemy cities. And that forced a considerable amount of diversion of funding towards the bomber effort in the 1920s and 30s. But it also meant that the Royal Navy, and to an increasing degree the Royal Air Force, had the ear of government in terms of funding. The army, which has existed solely to defend the empire, had no political voice. And indeed, there's an argument that says it didn't want a political voice. It didn't put its argument forward for creating integrated, combat-focused maneuver formations, i.e. a second British expeditionary force able to go to Europe, to operate it in a fully modern and integrated way. None of those arguments existed. There was not ever an argument about creating a continental commitment of that kind again until the late 1930s. And that's the problem. So the position of the British Army was always sub-strategic. And the way we illustrate that in the book is to say, well, if the British Army had been a bit more strategic, i.e. had been used as a deterrent, as indeed it was after 1946, the position of the army has changed substantially after that. We think it's declining again, but after 1946, it was regarded as a deterrent. If you have a strong army able to deploy to do things that the government needs it to do as part of its its domestic or foreign policy in a thoroughly Clausewitzian sense, then you needed an army that was capable, was large, and was mobile. And unfortunately, none of that happened. That whole idea that you could actually have at home in Britain an army that could deploy to Germany to enforce the Versailles Treaty and prevent the remilitarization by Hitler of the Rhineland in 1936. If we had had a expeditionary force able to fly at a moment's notice, put down 10,000 troops in the Rhineland, force the Wehrmacht to march back, they would have done so. We know that Hitler was terrified of a response against the remilitarization by the French or the British. He need not have worried, of course. The reason he was worried is because he had no real control over the army at the time. And the generals were very anti-Hitler. But of course, achieving a successful remilitarization of the Rhineland. Rhineland is a very, very significant part of Western Germany, very, very significant in geographical terms and massively important in financial terms because it included most of the Ruhr. 60 or 70% of German GDP came from the Rhineland. Remilitarizing it effectively brought it back into Germany. But it enabled Hitler to think more aggressively and purposefully about the ways in which he could use force. Rich and I had this sort of Damascene moment. We looked at each other and said, if Britain and France had deployed force to stop the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, we could have stopped the Second World War. That's the point about having a capable army able to be used as an element of your domestic or foreign policy. If you don't have it, you can't use it. Now, it just so happens that at the time, the political construct of the time, with Chamberlain just becoming prime minister, there was absolutely no way that Britain would have wanted to annoy Hitler by deploying troops to stop the remilitarization of the Rhineland, even though it was an egregious breaking of the Versailles Accords. And that's the problem. Britain, yes, it was an issue of money, but more importantly, it was an issue of the British Army not knowing what it wanted, not having a voice, and not asking for the money when it needed it. So the two failures ran parallel.
And indeed, if there was a second BEF that was able to support the French invasion into the Saar region in 1939 as well.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And of course, I keep on reminding people that one of the problems in the late 1930s is that we keep on saying to ourselves now, well, we in Britain regarded ourselves as providing the navy and the French providing the army to prevent another commitment of the British Army to Europe, a continental commitment. That's complete rubbish. There were no high-level staff talks between France and Britain to determine a breakdown of those defence efforts through the 1930s at all. The first time we started talking to the French, and indeed when we started doing it wasn't very productive in 1939, was simply about how we allocated the BEF, the second BEF, the 6 divisions, 3 regular, 3 territorial, to a new form of linear defence in France. There was no conversation at all about strategic defence between Britain and France. And if there had been, and of course this was one of the reasons for NATO, we realised at the end of the Second World War that in order to prevent those failures of strategic integration between France and Britain, again, we needed an organisation, starting first of all with the what became the Western European Union, then became NATO. It did need formal coordination, but you're absolutely right about the Saarland as well. What we all forget, really, is the progression of Nazi control over Germany in the late 1930s. And we have the sense that actually the Nazi party was in complete accord with the Wehrmacht and vice versa, and that the German armed forces worked and walked in lockstep with the Nazi party. It's simply not true. And we didn't recognize those differences. We didn't recognize how weak Hitler's position was in 1936, even in 1939. And the problem is with Hitler, the more successes he was able to achieve on the foreign affairs field in Europe, particularly with achieving his plan of Großdeutschland. This is the idea that all of Germany actually existed where German speakers lived, where there was German blood, an outrageously unsovereign view of the world. I mean, if Britain was to claim that the Anglo world and Britain's empire actually existed where everyone spoke English, we'd run the whole world. But it's complete nonsense. But that was Hitler's idea. German blood, German voice, German lands, Große Deutschland. Every step he made to achieve that the more he got the German army, the German armed forces behind him. So the 1930s was a dramatic failure of political imagination, diplomatic imagination. And that's why we came down very hard against Chamberlain, who I've got a lot of time for, actually. As a politician, we came down hard against him in respect of appeasement. The more, as Churchill said, you feed the crocodile, the more in danger you are of the crocodile eating you. And that's exactly what happened.
In the book, it does talk about his belief that he had superior strategic insights. But I think that's his insights were probably blinded by his abhorrence of the thought of a Second World War.
Yeah.
How do we enable better decision making in a case like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I've got a friend, Walter Reed. He's written a very good book on Chamberlain, trying to rehabilitate him, and I think I wrote the foreword. But it's a very good book in illuminating the nature of Chamberlain as a character. And I've got a lot of time for him as a person, but his policy decisions were way off. So one of the reasons why we had such poor decision-making, frankly, in the late 1930s, was effectively the power of the Prime Minister. We had no Ministry of Defence. Each of the three services had their own headquarters, and they operated against each other, not with each other. So those structural determinants of decision-making didn't exist. It was effectively, and we describe this in the book, as defence was a zero-sum game. Some lost, some won. And those with the loudest voice, the heaviest gavels, always won in the zero-sum game. And if the Navy was and lost, then everyone won, then everyone else lost. And it was a fundamental problem. The level of dialogue and trust and agreement between the parties didn't exist because there was no strategic plan. There was no grand strategic plan. And we go back in the book to this a number of times. Unless you have a grand strategic plan that sets out who the enemy is likely to be and what the worst case situation could be, you don't need to articulate it publicly. You could keep it as a secret plan, as indeed the secret plans exist. We, as a country, are very clear about who our likely adversary is. And we've got a number of plans articulated for defeating various options. Those didn't exist in the interwar years. The problem with Chamberlain, as Walter Reed beautifully describes him, was that although he hadn't fought in the First World War, he inherited the memory of the sacrifice. He was actually in the Caribbean for much of it, looking after his family estates. And he came back to Europe, to Britain, to an economy and a society ravaged by the consequences of the war. And he just couldn't ever contemplate doing that again. So I think the problem with Chamberlain is that even had there been a very clear understanding that war was coming, he was emotionally indisposed to supporting the army, building up army. There was a degree of naivety, I don't fully hold it, that says that, he believed that if you kept the army low, then it would become less of a threat to the enemy. He never really believed that. From 1935 as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he started pouring huge amounts of money back into defence. Unfortunately, it went the wrong place. It did go to the wrong. Well, it went to the Royal Navy. It went to the Royal Air Force to build obsolete bombers, and it very little went to the army. But at the same time, in 1935-36, the army wasn't thinking about how it might restructure itself on a maneuver basis, like the Germans. And so perhaps that money would have been wasted. In fact, we make that point in the book. A lot of money did go to the army, or the money that did go to the army went to mechanization, which meant that we had an army that was able to move in trucks. Now, that had its own problems because it wasn't accompanied by a doctrine of maneuver. It was a doctrine of movement. And if you're going to have a doctrine of movement, it's basically a doctrine of roads. If you're going to have an army of trucks, as we discovered in 1940, stuck to the roads, an army of maneuver with tanks, artillery, Stukas and so on could maneuver through the countryside around you and cut yourself off endlessly. And that is exactly what happened in 1940. It's exactly what happened in Malaya and Burma in 1942 as well. So throwing money at an army to mechanize it was frankly a waste of time if you didn't have a doctrine of maneuver to accompany it. And that's what the Germans had. Interestingly enough, the Germans didn't throw money at mechanization. Much of the German infantry in 1940 was accompanied on carts and horses, and artillery was brought up by horses as well. Very significant number of horses. Even by 1944, most, as my friend Peter Caddick Adams keeps on telling us, most German artillery was still horse-drawn in 1944. It was about how you used it in a maneuver sense, not how you mechanized it, which was the dramatic failure of the British to think about this. So going back to this point about dear old Nevile Chamberlain, an honourable man, good man, recognised that war was almost likely to come, wanted to identify every opportunity to prevent it, used a discredited methodology we call appeasement to grant Germany stuff that wasn't in our gift to grant them, but at the same time refused to increase the size of the army.
Another fascinating interview with Rob Lyman there. For me, the big takeaway is, how do you know if your doctrine is good enough? In 1918, the Allies could see the results from their doctrine when it was applied. Those 20 years in the interwar period, combined with the lack of economic, technological and intellectual investment in the doctrine, meant that most of the Allied nations were unable to defend themselves in 1939. Rectifying those deficiencies is incredibly difficult, especially when you are fighting a war. It was 3 years for the British Army before they were able to conduct a battle like Second El Alamein. Not only was there a requirement for development of doctrine, but also a development of the force structure so that the army would be able to create those effects on the battlefield. There was also investments in logistics and manufacturing. And remember, we weren't just after a combined arms effect, we wanted to make it joint. How was that done? Well, we're going to cover that in the next episode.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.